The onion-thin page of a Bible makes a dry little whisper under your thumb. And right there, in Romans 12, verse 2, one English word may have trained generations to hear the line smaller than Paul wrote it. Transformed sounds safe to modern ears, almost decorative. But the Greek behind it, metamorphoō, does not feel decorative at all. You were probably taught to hear that verse as a gentle church sentence. Improve your attitude, clean up your thoughts, become a better version of the same inner person. That is the common reading. The trouble is, Paul did not reach for a soft word. He used the same root that gives you metamorphosis, a change of form so deep the old arrangement cannot keep running the show in the same way. That is already a different conversation. And once you hear it that way, the rest of the verse starts pressing on you. Be not conformed to this world. Conformed to what exactly? To fashion? To culture? To bad influences? Yes, maybe some of that, but also to pattern, to repeated shaping, which is awkward because your mind already lives inside patterns before you say a prayer, open a book, or even notice what you are thinking. It loops, it predicts, it wanders. It hands you the same reactions like familiar tools in the dark. Modern neuroscience has a name for part of that machinery. Scripture had a warning for it long before the label arrived. And if those two are talking about the same thing, then the renewing of the mind is not a vague religious slogan at all. It may be an instruction with a mechanism under it. And that's where this gets uncomfortable. If you want the next piece, subscribe and stay with me. And that changes the pressure of the verse immediately, because it is written as an instruction, not a compliment. You can hear the difference if you slow down and let the words sit there for a second. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Paul is not admiring the idea from a distance. He is addressing you as someone expected to enter a process. That is where the common reading starts to wobble. You were handed a version that sounds passive, almost like interchange is something that hovers over a person while they remain mentally arranged the same way they were yesterday. But then you run into a problem inside the text itself. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 16 says, "The inward man is renewed day by day." Day by day has texture to it. It sounds like repetition. It sounds like return. It sounds like something that happens in lived time, with mornings and evenings and distracted afternoons. Not only in a dramatic spiritual moment with music in the background and emotion running high. That matters because this becomes harder to shrink into a slogan once you notice the cadence. Daily renewal implies practice. It implies participation. And if it involves repeated mental activity, then the old religious split between belief over here and what your brain does all day over there starts to collapse. This is where a modern word walks into the room: neuroplasticity. The brain can rewire through repeated activity. That is not motivational language. That is observed function, which means the question gets sharper and a little uncomfortable too. If repeated thought and repeated attention are already shaping the mind every day, then what exactly are your ordinary habits building when you are not trying to build anything at all? That question is where the old religious language stops floating and starts getting weight. In 1949, Donald Hebb put a principle into circulation that later got shortened into one line people could actually remember: neurons that fire together wire together. The phrase is plain spoken, but the implication is not small. Repetition strengthens a root. Use a path often enough, and access gets easier. The mind starts reaching for it with less effort, almost the way your hand finds the same light switch in a dark room. Now listen to Philippians 4, verse 8, with that in your ear. Whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, think on these things. That stops sounding like decorative church language. It starts sounding targeted. Paul is assigning categories for repeated attention. He is telling you where to place mental traffic. And if Hebb is right, repeated placement is never empty. It leaves tracks. This is exactly where many people were misled. You were taught that right belief was the whole game, as if agreement by itself completed the work. But attention is an activity. Dwelling is an activity. Rehearsing fear is an activity too. And so is rehearsing bitterness, envy, shame, or endless self-defense. Those are not harmless inner habits. They are training sessions, whether you scheduled them or not. So this renewal starts looking less like inspiration and more like direction under repetition. Every return matters. Every loop is doing something. Every unchallenged pattern is voting for the next one. And once you see that, another piece clicks into place. Because science did not stop with theory. At some point, somebody put the human brain in a scanner and asked whether sustained practice leaves fingerprints you can actually see. That question did get asked, and the answer came back in images. In 2011, researchers connected with Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital, including Holtzel and Lazar, looked at what happened when people practiced meditation over 8 weeks. Not a lifetime in a cave, not some exotic spectacle. A short, repeated discipline, about 27 minutes a day. Before and after, the brain was scanned. And one of the changes that stood out was increased gray matter density in the hippocampus. Now, if you were raised to hear inner renewal as a nice religious metaphor, that should stop you cold for a second, because the hippocampus is tied to learning and memory. Practice was not staying in the realm of private sentiment. It showed up in tissue. Quiet attention, repeated over time, left a trace you could measure. This is where the whole discussion gets awkward for the passive version of faith. You can sit in a room, nod at a sermon, agree with every line, and still keep rehearsing the same fear, the same resentment, the same mental noise the rest of the week. Agreement alone does not train attention. Repetition does. That study did not photograph opinions. It photographed consequence. So when Paul speaks about renewal, you have to at least consider the possibility that the instruction reaches deeper than belief statements. The mind is not only persuaded, it is practiced. And what is practiced begins to settle into structure. Now bring that back to your own ordinary day. The coffee cup in your hand, the buzz of the phone on the counter, the half-finished thought that returns before breakfast. All of that is repetition too. Which means the experiment may already be running inside you, even when you never chose it. And that leads to the next piece, because there is a modern name for the brain's drifting, self-running background state. That background state matters more than most people realize, because your mind does not wait politely for your conscious permission before it starts moving. Neuroscience calls one part of that background traffic the default mode network. It tends to light up when attention is loose, when the eyes are open but the focus is gone, when the room is quiet and the inner commentary starts filling it. You know the feeling, the low electric hum of the refrigerator, the pale light from a window, your body sitting still while your thoughts run 3 conversations ahead and somehow drift backward at the same time. Regret, rehearsal, self-argument, worry. The same loops, wearing different clothes. Now read Romans 12, verse 2 again. Be not conformed. If your mind has an idling pattern that keeps pulling you into familiar tracks, then conformity is not only social pressure out there somewhere, it is also internal repetition. It is the ease with which the old route takes over because you have walked it so many times. That should unsettle you a little, because it means passivity is not neutral. If you leave the mind unattended, it does not remain blank like a clean sheet of paper on a desk. It defaults, it wanders, it circles. And over time, those circles start to feel like personality, like fate, like this is just how I am, when some of it may be trained drift. This is why mind renewal carries more force than people were told. The issue is not only what you believe at your brightest moment. The issue is what keeps running when no one is watching, when no sermon is playing, when your thoughts are left alone with themselves. And once that becomes clear, another question pushes forward. What in you can interrupt the drift instead of being carried by it? That "what in you" question has a very practical edge, because renewal only means something if attention can actually be guided. One of the key players here is the prefrontal cortex, the part associated with choosing, holding focus, stopping an impulse before it runs, staying with a task when the mind would rather wander. You feel its work in ordinary moments. The phone vibrates. A memory rises. An old irritation knocks at the door. And there is a split second, almost physical, where you either go with it or stay put. That small act of staying is easy to underestimate. It feels quiet. It does not look dramatic. But in terms of the mind, it is the difference between drifting and directing. This is why passive religion misses the point so badly. You can admire truth and still fail to practice attention. You can quote Romans 12, verse 2, and spend the rest of the day being tugged around by every fear, every fantasy, every inner argument that knows the root better than you do. The renewing of the mind asks more from you than agreement. It asks for repeated return. That is where neuroplasticity becomes personal. What you repeatedly return to begins, over time, to become easier to return to again. And now, the older wording from Paul sounds much less foggy. If the old path can be strengthened, then a new one can be strengthened too. The command is not floating above your biology. It lands right in the middle of it. Which means the real issue is no longer whether change is possible. The issue is whether you are already practicing the wrong thing all day long, and whether there is a disciplined way to interrupt that background machinery before it names your inner life for you. That disciplined way has been hiding in plain sight, and the strange part is that Scripture has been more concrete about it than many people admit. Take Psalm 1. The blessed man meditates on the law day and night. Joshua 1 verse 8 says something similar. The image is not occasional inspiration. It is sustained return. You bring the mind back again and again until truth is no longer a visitor passing through the house. It begins to stay. Once you place that beside what we already know about repetition, those old verses stop sounding ornamental. They start sounding procedural. And this is where you have to be honest about your own inner schedule, because meditation, in the biblical sense, is not only a word for admiration, it is a word for mental dwelling. You are already doing it with something, maybe with fear, maybe with the memory that stings every time it comes back, maybe with a future disaster that has not happened and may never happen. The default mode network does not need your permission to keep feeding that loop. It only needs your inattention. So the work becomes very practical. You interrupt drift by choosing an object for attention before it chooses one for you. A line of scripture, a short prayer, the breath steady in the chest, a single phrase repeated with intention. When the mind slips, you return it, quietly, without theater. That return may feel small, almost too small to matter, but repeated return is exactly how pathways are trained. Now the old complaint starts to fall apart. The one that says, I tried once and nothing happened. Of course, nothing dramatic happened once. The whole argument has been about practice, accumulation, reinforcement. Which means the next question is not whether one moment can save your attention. It is what happens when you train it on purpose for weeks. And that is exactly why the timeline matters. People hear a verse like this and expect a lightning strike. One breakthrough prayer, one emotional Sunday, one powerful moment, and the inner machinery is supposed to fall into line. But the evidence points in a different direction. In that 2011 work from Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital, Holtzel and Lazar were looking at what repeated practice does across weeks. The change showed up through increased gray matter density in the hippocampus. That is the sort of finding that forces you to slow down, because it places patience right in the center of the discussion. So when scripture speaks in daily language and research speaks in repeated sessions, those are not two unrelated worlds. They converge on the same pressure point. You become shaped by what you return to. Slowly, sometimes quietly, but still truly. The room may feel unchanged. The chair feels the same under your body. The air hums. The mind wanders, comes back, wanders again. Yet underneath that plain surface, rehearsal is taking place. This is where many people quit too early. They judge the practice by whether it felt dramatic. They treat attention like entertainment, and if nothing spectacular happens in 10 minutes, they assume nothing happened at all. But repetition is often unimpressive in the moment. A path in grass does not appear after one footstep. It appears after many crossings. Which brings this right down to your actual schedule. If a few weeks of directed attention can leave a visible mark, then your daily mental life is already accumulating somewhere. The question is no longer whether the brain records practice. The question is what kind of record you are making from morning to night, and whether you are ready to change the routine that keeps writing it. So now the issue becomes almost embarrassingly practical. If repeated attention is shaping you, then the first battlefield is not some dramatic public crisis. It is the ordinary, unguarded minute. The lamp clicks on beside the bed. The floor feels cool under your feet. The phone screen glows before your eyes are even fully awake. And right there, before the day has properly begun, something starts claiming your mind. News, memory, comparison, dread. You call it routine, but routine is where formation hides. This is why it cannot stay an idea you admire from a distance. It has to move into sequence. You choose a small span of time. You sit down. You place your attention somewhere on purpose. A line from Romans 12, verse 2. A short prayer. The breath moving in and out. Then the wandering starts. Of course it does. The mind slips toward yesterday, toward tomorrow, toward unfinished conversations. And every time you notice it and return, you are doing the very thing most people never learned to value. You are training direction. That is why Donald Hebb still matters here. Neurons that fire together wire together is not only a lab phrase. It explains why return counts. The repeated act is the work, not the mood, not the atmosphere, the return. Over days, that tiny motion stops being tiny. And once you hear Paul's word, metamorphoō, with all of this in view, the verse becomes harder to domesticate. A change of form does not begin with applause. It begins with repeated reordering. Which leaves one final question hanging in the air. If this instruction is real, what would it look like for you to begin tonight with no performance and no excuses? So here is where the puzzle resolves. The renewing of the mind in Romans 12, verse 2, was never a decorative sentence floating above your actual life. Paul used metamorphoō because he was pointing to a change with structure in it. Modern language gives you neuroplasticity for the same territory. Repeated activity reshapes the pathways that repeated activity keeps using. Hebb gave the rule in plain form. Holzel and Lazar gave a visible clue in the scanner. Scripture gave the command long before the machinery had a laboratory name. That is why passive agreement was never enough. A person can admire truth and still live by mental reflex. A person can say holy words and keep feeding the same grooves every morning. Renewal enters through repetition, through chosen attention, through return. That is the hard part, and also the hopeful part. The door is small, but it is real. Tonight, before the house settles all the way into silence, sit down for a little while. Leave the screen dark. Let the room be ordinary. Take one line with you if you need one. Romans 12, verse 2, or Philippians 4, verse 8, or simply be still from Psalm 46, verse 10. When the mind runs, notice it. Bring it back. Then do the same tomorrow. Let the work be plain enough to repeat. A wheelbarrow track in wet soil does not deepen because someone admired the field. It deepens because the same route was taken again, and then again, until the ground began to remember. By morning, the window will hold that thin gray light before sunrise. The kettle will start its low hiss, and the first thought of the day will arrive. That is where the renewing begins.